Hello to all Cinemaster lovers. Hope you enjoy watching. Let's get started. The series begins between the years 1916 and 1970, specifically in North Carolina. At that time, Livia, sitting at home with her young son Chester. Suddenly, she notices that her dog has left the house, and when she follows it, she finds it standing next to an old woman. However, the woman seems odd, and her behavior is unsettling, with suspicious glances, and she sings a mocking song about people with dark skin. This angers Livia, as she and her family are black. When the woman hears Chester crying, she wants to enter the house and take him from Livia. Livia yells at her, feeling very scared, and asks her to leave immediately. Livia then goes inside, holding her son, still feeling anxious and frightened. After a few years, Livia in her car with her husband Henry and their two daughters, Ruby and Gracie. We learn that they are moving to a new city in California. Ruby is a bit worried that they won't find people like them there, and by that, she means others with dark skin like theirs. This is because, at the time, about 6 million African Americans had migrated from the South to the Northeast, in what was known as the Great Migration, as black families were trying to escape the racist Jim Crow laws in the South. After the tragic incident that happened to Livia and her son, Henry and Livia decided to leave North Carolina and head to California, specifically to Compton. In Compton, Betty, at her house, suddenly, she notices Helen from the real estate office taking down the for sale sign from the house across the street. Betty, curious, goes out to ask her who bought the house. Helen tells her it's a family with 2 daughters. At that moment, all the neighbors gather around, just as curious as Betty. When Henry and his family arrive at the house they bought, they notice all the neighbors staring at them with strange, uncomfortable looks. Even the children seem annoyed by their presence. At that same moment, Betty's neighbor calls her, informing her that the new neighbors are black. Betty smiles, but it's a strange, unsettling smile. She and her neighbors watch them in shock and anger. Livia notices this and feels uncomfortable, but Betty waves at her with a bizarre smile. Afterward, Betty goes back inside her house, visibly angry. Meanwhile, Henry and his family are touring their new home with Helen. While signing the sale contract, Livia notices a strange clause in the contract that prohibits selling any house in the neighborhood to people with dark skin. Helen tells her that this was something from the past, only written on paper, and they could easily ignore it because it's no longer relevant. Helen assures them that the house is now theirs. However, Livia is upset with Henry for not telling her that the neighborhood was resistant to black families living there. She looks out the window and sees the neighborhood residents gathered, talking about them, which makes her anxious and scared. Later that night, Henry wakes up to find Livia still awake, unable to sleep, holding a gun to protect herself and her family. The next morning, Henry finds Betty and the rest of the neighbors sitting in the middle of the street in front of his house with chairs, playing loud music from a recorder. Henry leaves for the factory where he'll be working, but the receptionist mistakes him for a janitor because of his skin color. He corrects her, saying he's there to meet Stuart, the factory manager, as he is starting a job in the engineering department. A black man named Calvin shows up and escorts Henry to the engineering department. When Calvin learns that Henry is living in Compton with his family, he warns him about the residents there, explaining that they're very racist toward black people. Calvin shares that there was once a black couple who were driven insane by the harassment they faced, which eventually forced them to leave the neighborhood. When Henry reaches his office, he notices that his colleagues are staring at him with curiosity, but he chooses to ignore it. Meanwhile, back at home, Livia enters the room where her daughter Gracie is playing. Gracie tells her mother that she wants to go to school like Ruby and starts singing a song she had memorized. The moment Gracie begins to sing, Livia completely breaks down and yells at Gracie because the song is the same one the old woman had sung before. Gracie explains that Vera had taught her the song, but Livia reminds her that Vera is just an imaginary friend in her mind and asks her not to sing that song again. Later that night, all the neighbors gather and decide to come up with a plan to force Henry and his family to leave the neighborhood. However, Betty seems disinterested in the plan, as if she's not entirely opposed to the presence of a black family in the neighborhood. A bit later, when everyone is asleep, Gracie wakes up and realizes that the dog is no longer beside her. She starts searching for the dog throughout the apartment. Suddenly, she encounters a terrifying tall woman inside the house who approaches her and strangles her. The next morning, Livia goes to wake up her daughters and notices that Gracie's neck is scratched. She becomes terrified and urgently asks Gracie who did this to her. Gracie replies that it was the evil Vera who did it, and that she also took their dog. Henry immediately checks the house to see if someone had broken in during the night. That's when he discovers the basement door open and finds their dog dead inside. This discovery causes Livia to break down completely. She grabs the gun and storms out into the street, screaming and yelling, threatening all the neighbors. At the same time, the residents are shocked by Livia's behavior. A flashback to 1946 in North Carolina. At this time, Ruby is a young child, and Livia is pregnant with Gracie. Henry is extremely distressed and irritable. When he and Livia are alone, he shares with her the traumatic experiences he and his fellow soldiers, who were black, went through in the army. They were subjected to testing of various gases before they were used on the Germans, and weren't allowed to use weapons during the war because they were deemed unfit, although the real reason was their racial prejudice. Livia tries to comfort him and soothe his pain. That night, Henry finds a small dog scratching at the door and decides to bring it into the house to adopt and raise it. Back in the present, the police have arrived at the neighborhood, knocking on Henry's door. Henry and his family are terrified. He quickly hides the gun and asks Livia to calm down before answering the door. The officers come into the house and inform Henry and Livia that their neighbors reported them for brandishing a gun. One of the officers holds a picture of Livia with her son, Chester, which makes Gracie very upset for touching the picture of her brother. Meanwhile, Betty goes to speak with Sergeant, the officer standing outside the house, asking why Livia and Henry haven't been arrested yet. The sergeant explains that no crime has been committed for them to be arrested, no shots were fired, and they can't arrest people just because the neighbors are afraid. He also mentions that unless something tangible happens, they can't take any action. The sergeant then goes inside Henry and Livia's house to inspect the basement, where Henry shows him the dead dog. The officer suggests that the previous owners may have left poison around to kill rats, and that the dog may have ingested it. At this moment, Gracie tells the other officer that evil Vera killed the dog, but he dismisses her story, thinking she's making it up. Livia shows him the scratches on Gracie's neck, but when the officer checks, the scratches have completely vanished. After the police leave, Henry buries the dog in the yard. Livia is furious with Henry for not telling the officers the truth, but Henry argues that they wouldn't believe them, as Vera is just an imaginary friend in Gracie's mind, not someone they can accuse of murder. Later, Henry drops Ruby off at school, and she asks if their mother is crazy because what she did that morning, holding a gun and threatening the neighbors, wasn't normal. Henry reassures Ruby, telling her that their mother is going through a tough time and needs their support. At home, Livia and Gracie go down to the basement together to make sure everything is locked up securely. Livia notices that one of the windows isn't closed properly, and thinks that whoever entered the house the previous night must have come through there. But Gracie tells her that Vera is with them in the basement right now. Livia, growing anxious, tries to reassure Gracie that Vera isn't real and only exists in her imagination. Gracie insists that Vera is standing there and is surprised that her mother can't see her, especially since Vera's smell is so strong. Livia, now deeply unsettled, asks Gracie what Vera smells like. Gracie replies that Vera smells like a dead animal. Livia starts to panic because she can actually smell something foul, as if something or someone rotten is standing right in front of her, even though she can't see it. At that moment, the window suddenly opens on its own, and Livia becomes extremely scared. She grabs Gracie, and they quickly leave the basement. Livia talks to Gracie afterward, letting her know that she believes her, but she asks her to promise not to tell her father what just happened. Gracie then tells her that she doesn't like the house, and that ever since they moved in, she's been seeing evil Vera, who appears to her in a terrifying and harmful way. Gracie is scared that Vera will do to her what she did to the dog. Livia reassures her that this won't happen, and promises to protect her from anything. Meanwhile, Betty is at Midge's house, trying to convince her that they need to participate in getting the black neighbors out of the community. She shows her what the newspapers are saying about black people and how they're a danger to any place they live in. Midge then surprises her by revealing that she and her husband Dale have decided to move, and Dale told Clark, Betty's husband, about the decision the night before. Betty is shocked and upset that Clark didn't tell her anything, and she becomes furious, smiling with anger and hatred. At school, Ruby is struggling with the stares of her classmates. In class, everyone mocks her and calls her a chimpanzee, which causes her to break down in tears. Her teacher gives her extra homework as punishment, accusing her of causing trouble in the class. In detention, Ruby sits next to a girl named Doris, who is kind to her and tells her that she's never seen such a beautiful black girl before. Later, Livia is at the supermarket buying an axe. Meanwhile, Henry is suffering from hallucinations at work, seeing a man burning from gas. He realizes he is still haunted by the cruelty he experienced during his time in the army. That night, Betty talks to her husband Clark, expressing her anger at Midge for deciding to leave the neighborhood and abandon the fight against their black neighbors. Instead of fighting alongside them, Midge and Dale chose to run away. Betty then takes sugar and pours it into the gas tank of Dale's car. At the same time, Henry is sitting with his family at the dinner table, eating blueberry pie frantically as he's overwhelmed with emotion. The pie reminds him of the time he had just returned from the army, and both Livia and Ruby are worried about him. Henry continues to recall the dog's death and how he buried it. During this time, blood appears at the spot where the dog is buried. The next morning, Livia finds her 2 daughters missing from their room and learns that Henry has taken them out. While hanging the laundry, She spots a small child making a mess and chases him down the street with a stick, drawing hostile looks from the neighborhood. Henry is at an appliance store entertaining his daughters, watching a TV program that mocks black people. When Henry and the girls return home, they are excited about the TV show, but the delivery man, who is black, warns Henry to be cautious as he and his family are living in a dangerous neighborhood. Meanwhile, Betty is with George, a neighbor who has invited her to visit his farm. Betty is upset that George and his wife are planning to move, which George mentions only to Clark, Betty's husband. Betty is displeased with the news and reacts with anger and bitterness. Back at the house, Betty gathers the neighbors and discovers that many of them are considering moving out due to the black families in the neighborhood. Clark decides to meet with the men of the neighborhood to find a solution to remove the new black families. During this meeting, Martin, one of the men, expresses his frustration with Henry and tries to pacify the group. Henry, enraged, threatens the men, causing them to reconsider their actions. Livia visits Hazel, who is related to Henry, and appreciates the warm family atmosphere she experiences. However, she starts feeling unwell and returns home quickly. At the neighborhood meeting, Martin speaks on behalf of Clark and recounts their confrontation with Henry, demanding his immediate departure. Betty's frustration escalates, and she makes a passionate and aggressive speech about the history of black people and their place in society, criticizing their right to live in their world and neighborhoods. Later, Livia is harassed by a menacing stranger in a hat who tries to pull her off a bus. She ends up on the ground, screaming, and the bus driver threatens to call the police. Sergeant arrives, talks to Livia, and advises her that to gain acceptance from the neighborhood, she must ensure they feel safe. He allows her to return home without arresting her. Livia, distraught, tells Henry about the disturbing incident. Henry tries to calm her and suggests she needs to get over what happened to their son, but Livia insists that something is wrong and urges him to believe her. She then leaves and retreats to her room. Meanwhile, Clark has gathered all the men in front of Henry's house, and they are singing a racist song against black people, setting fire to the world nigger heaven in the garden. Clark and Betty are both pleased with the events unfolding. The next morning, Henry discovers several black dolls hanging in his garden. He rushes back inside to make sure Ruby and Gracie are safe before they leave. Livia is shocked when she sees the dolls from the window. Henry talks to Ruby and Gracie, realizing that no one is paying attention to the sick and mentally ill people in their community, which is what they need to address now. As they leave the house and get into the car, Henry tries to calm Livia, who is extremely agitated. He presents them with 3 options. The first is to get the gun and kill everyone in the neighborhood, which would land him in jail and they would lose their daughters. The second is to stay home, keep the children from school, and be trapped inside the house. The third is to ignore everything happening to them. Henry decides the third option is the best. Livia is calmed down, but as soon as Henry leaves, she sees Betty standing outside, laughing at her. Livia confronts Betty, but Betty tells her that she and her family aren't wanted in the neighborhood and that they should leave if they care about their safety. Livia threatens Betty if she comes near her or her family. Later, Livia visits the notary's office and meets Helen to discuss selling their house and getting their money back. Helen informs her that this isn't possible until a certain period passes and they continue paying the mortgage. Livia leaves upset. Betty goes to sit with George, telling him about what happened with Livia and how audacious and rude she is. She tells George she needs a break from everything, and he offers his support and tells her she can come to him anytime. At school, Ruby is alone when Doris approaches her and asks if she wants to see something. Ruby agrees and follows Doris to a storage room where 2 classmates are engaging in inappropriate behavior to scare them and control their nerves. Ruby finds it amusing and laughs when she sees them running away terrified. Doris then puts makeup on Ruby and tells her she is beautiful and should show her beauty. Suddenly, the janitor enters, and Ruby is taken out of the room. Ruby was alone in the room, and Doris was never there. Ruby was alone with a very frightening-looking figure. At this time, Livia is at the home of a neighbor named Johnson, who, by chance, is revealed to be black and has been hiding due to fear of leaving her house. Johnson recounts days when she couldn't sleep or eat due to fear for her children because of threats and the filthy conditions imposed by the neighborhood and the frightening man wearing a hat. Johnson explains that this man instructed her on how to be liked and not disturbed, telling her she needed to stay clean, so she takes a shower 10 times a day to make her skin white and clean like theirs. Livia is shocked by Johnson's situation. Suddenly, Ronald, Johnson's husband, appears, and Livia is horrified to see that he has lost his legs. Johnson smiles and talks about her children. Suddenly, the oven timer rings, and Johnson, smiling, says that her children are ready. She goes to the kitchen, and Livia, terrified, follows her. She finds the kitchen covered in blood and sees Johnson pulling her children out of the oven, having cooked them. Livia is stunned and runs out of the house in shock. Meanwhile, Henry is at a private factory party where Stuart asks him to leave before Stoll, the factory owner, sees him, as he hasn't mentioned that one of the engineers working on the project is black. Henry is then introduced to Stewart and talks with him, revealing that he is an engineer with credentials from a prestigious university. Stewart is impressed by Henry's intelligence. At the same time, Betty is at her parents' house, where they are upset because she hasn't visited or communicated with them for over 7 years, especially since her visit is to get a large sum of money. Her father insists she stay the night before receiving the check. Betty reluctantly agrees, but suddenly she breaks down, cries, and runs out of her parents' house. When Henry returns home, he finds Livia frightened and distressed. She insists they must go immediately to Johnson's house. When they arrive, Johnson is surprised by their presence and Livia's unusual distress. Livia attempts to show Henry what Johnson has done, but the kitchen is clean and there's no sign of anything amiss. Johnson then explains that her children are staying with their aunt for the night and that her husband has been mute since returning from the war. Henry and Livia leave and return to their own home. A flashback to the time when Johnson and Ronald arrived in California, specifically to Compton. They're at Helen's real estate office to purchase the house she showed them. At that time, Johnson notices a clause in the contract that states no black person is allowed to live in the neighborhood. Helen reassures Johnson that this clause is outdated and can easily be removed from the contract since the world has changed and progressed. Ronald signs the contract, buying the house with a large bank loan. Helen is colluding with Officer Sargent in defrauding black individuals, selling them houses and encouraging them to take out loans to profit from them. After Helen gets into her car, she is confronted by a local resident who threatens her, demanding that she ensure no black families move into their neighborhood. A flashback to the time when Livia was at her home with her son Chester in North Carolina. Specifically, this is when she saw the elderly woman in front of her house, singing a racist song against black people. When Livia hears Chester crying, she asks her to take him, but in her fear, she quickly enters the house. Suddenly, she sees a group of men coming toward the house. They break the window and enter. Livia hides her son in a room and locks it, but the men attack her. They drug her, and the older woman takes Chester from the room where Livia had hidden him. She puts him in a pillowcase and, while playing with it like a ball, causes the child to suffocate and die inside the pillowcase. Afterward, they leave the house. Livia and Henry at their son's funeral, deeply shocked and mourning. Livia is devastated and hits one of the mourners who came to console her, simply because the mourner expressed condolences for her son's death. As time passes, Livia remains silent, and her behavior becomes increasingly bizarre, to the point that Gracie and Ruby are scared of her. Henry tries to calm the children and reassure them. One night, Henry sees Livia holding the pillowcase in which their son died, crying uncontrollably. After some time, Henry decides they need to move to California and leave North Carolina, but Livia refuses to leave the house where she lived with their son. Henry tries to make her understand that they have 2 daughters who need their mother with them. Returning to the present, Livia wakes up angry from a dream in which she killed Ruby with an axe. She finds her hands and feet dirty. Later in the bathroom, she sees blood in the sink while shaving. At breakfast, Ruby is trembling. Meanwhile, Livia is straightening Gracie's hair. Visualizing, she burns her hair. Suddenly, she regains her consciousness due to her daughter's scream as she harmed her neck by accident. Henry goes to work, but Stewart punishes him and fires him because his replacement didn't do his job properly, and Henry is penalized due to his skin color. He tries to keep his temper in check to avoid regrettable actions. Meanwhile, Livia is at Hazel's house, recounting her troubles. Hazel suggests that they're seen as crazy for moving to Compton, a neighborhood known to be predominantly white. She also mentions that Livia accidentally burned her daughter due to not knowing how to use the iron, not for any other reason. Hazel advises Livia to talk about Chester, as it's a significant part of her ongoing distress. Hazel recounts the story of the Beaumonts, a family of black people who, due to the pressures from the neighborhood, went mad and killed their entire family before being admitted to a mental institution. This story shocks Livia, and she quickly leaves Hazel's house. She goes to a mental health facility to meet with Arnett and asks if she is married and has children, revealing her intention to kill them soon. Arnett continues her narrative, explaining that her mother always said that white life was always beautiful, and Arnett didn't understand the meaning until she moved to Compton. One day, without realizing it, she uses bleach to lighten her son's and husband's skin, believing this will make their lives beautiful as her mother had said. They are severely burned and die. Arnett explains that she did this because of the man with the hat, and this makes her laugh more. Meanwhile, Betty is at the bank, discovering that her husband Clark withdrew all the money from their joint account without telling her. Betty is furious. At school, Ruby sees Doris again and asks her to join the cheerleading team. Ruby, surprised, asks Ruby about why she doesn't have other friends besides her. Doris says that she feels that Ruby is a kind. In kindergarten, when Gracie goes to the board to recite the national anthem, her classmates laugh at her because she is scared. and can't speak properly. This is because she sees Vera standing at the window watching her. Doris breaks down and cries, repeatedly saying just one sentence which terrifies her classmates. Later, Livia goes to the kindergarten to pick up Gracie and asks the teacher about the meaning of the sentence Doris kept repeating. When Henry returns home, he finds the house empty and watches television, feeling angry and distressed about losing his job. He laughs hysterically without realizing it, and starts imagining the sarcastic man from the TV asking him to seek revenge on the person who upset him. Henry then goes to the Stewart house and tries to enter without being seen, but when someone passes by, Henry attacks and beats them. At that time, Ruby goes to the gym as planned with Doris and finds the cheerleading team practicing. She joins them and dances, but we discover that Ruby sees people who are not actually there and is dancing and swinging. Meanwhile, Livia learns from Gracie what the sentence Doris said at kindergarten meant, but Gracie doesn't respond. As a white family passes by and looks at them with anger, Gracie tells her mother that she wants to leave the place. At the same moment, Betty leaves her house, mocks Livia, and annoys her. Livia reacts by slapping Betty, which shocks Betty. Betty returns home, destroys everything around her, tears down the wallpaper, and is devastated. She calls George, asking for his help, and then goes to his farm to request that he assist her in taking revenge on Livia because she slapped her. George warns her that this request is very dangerous, but Betty insists, and George agrees to help her. Meanwhile, Livia is packing her things and those of her family from their home. She tells Gracie that she believes her and knows that Vera is appearing to her and causing distress. She advises her not to be afraid and to let her know if Betty or anyone from the neighborhood bothers her so that she can deal with them. Later, Hazel visits Livia and sits with her, discussing things. Hazel asks Livia to look at a picture of her son Chester and tells her that she needs to accept that Chester is in the heaven and that she shouldn't be sad because God has spared him from all that is happening now. During this time, Clark is at home with Earl and Marty when Officer Sargent arrives after being notified that the house is in disarray and Betty is missing. They're worried she might have been kidnapped and suspect that Henry and his family might be responsible. After Earl and Marty leave, Sargent tells Clark that Betty left the house voluntarily since her wallet and bag are missing. Betty is asleep at George's house. When she wakes up, she finds George with a rope and asks him to take her with him to kill Henry's family because she wants to see them suffer. However, it becomes clear that George has drugged Betty because he is obsessed with her and doesn't believe she is finally in his house with him. George then assaults Betty due to the drug. Meanwhile, Henry is sitting in a cafe, arguing with the sarcastic man from the television. The man tells Henry that he should keep his thoughts private and continues to mock him, claiming Henry is a failure, even in getting revenge on his boss. Henry explains that he went to Stewart's house to confront him, but Stewart was not there. The sarcastic man continues to belittle Henry, reminding him of his past failures, including the attack on his wife in North Carolina and the old woman killing their child. As Henry is distressed by the sarcastic man's words, Hazel speaks with Livia, telling her that they need to avenge their children who died and lived in fear because of white people. Hazel insists that they should never let them come near them again. At this moment, Hazel's hands start bleeding, and Gracie arrives, seeing her mother's strange behavior. Gracie notices that her mother is not seeing anyone else and sees Hazel's horrifying and disfigured face. At school, Ruby is still there and sees Doris sitting with her, applying makeup. Doris asks Ruby what she wishes for now. Ruby, without hesitation, says she wishes to change her skin color to become beautiful and perfect so no one will bother or mock her again. Doris then tells Ruby to close her eyes, and when she opens them, she sees a white paint can in front of her. Ruby covers her entire body with the paint and leaves the school, drawing the attention of everyone who sees her. Later, Livia and Gracie arrive at the house, and Gracie asks her mother who she was talking to upstairs, noticing that no one is in the house. Suddenly, Livia appears with an axe, approaches Gracie, and tells her she is gonna take her to Chester, her brother. During this time, the man with the hat is standing next to Livia, and as she is holding the axe, she tries to escape. However, she snaps back to reality and reassures Gracie that she has returned to her normal self. Ruby arrives home and tells her mother that she's not herself and is experiencing strange things. Meanwhile, Sargent, Henry, and the others discover what happened at Betty's house. Sargent asks Henry how he would feel if his wife were missing, which upsets Henry, especially when Sargent mocks Livia's hallucinations. Henry then shoots Sargent and returns home. At home, Henry finds Livia in the bathroom with Ruby, cleaning off the paint she had covered herself with. Livia apologizes for bringing her family to that place and decides to leave with them. However, Earl and Marty, believing Henry and his family are responsible for Betty's disappearance, confront Henry and threaten him with a gun. Clark tries to calm them down to avoid violence. Henry finds a strange box on the bed and, upon opening it, is horrified to find Chester's body inside. He cries out loudly, which is heard by everyone. and he leaves the house carrying his son's body. Livia explains to Henry through tears that she couldn't leave Chester alone in North Carolina and had taken him out of his grave to keep him with her. Livia is then in a psychiatric hospital, and Henry requests to see her. Dr. Mohnhan tells him that it's not beneficial for Livia's treatment or for their daughters to see her in this state. Henry becomes frustrated with her response. Livia meets with Arnett and recounts the events, including her intention to kill her younger daughter with the axe because the man with the hat manipulated her. In the meantime, George keeps Betty at his farm, obsessively caring for her. Betty, stunned by George's behavior, finds herself locked in a room under the farm to prevent escape. When George returns home, he prepares a romantic dinner, and Betty pretends to be content to gain his trust. However, she then stabs him with a knife, leaving George shocked and fleeing. Marty and Earl confront Henry and his daughters, believing that Henry is hiding Betty. They threaten to harm Ruby and Gracie if Henry doesn't reveal Betty's location. They lock Gracie in a room and Ruby in the kitchen. Marty accuses Livia of killing their son and burying him in the house, but Henry denies it, claiming that it was white people like them who killed Chester. Marty decides to torture Henry and cuts off one of his fingers. He then prepares a noose to hang Henry. Ruby and Gracie attempt to help their father but fail. Meanwhile, Livia, in the psychiatric hospital, begs Dr. Mohnhan to allow her to see her family. Dr. Mohnhan tells her that her family doesn't want to see her. Livia, in disbelief, insists that Henry wouldn't say such things. That night, Livia wakes up tied to her bed and sees Nurse Burgess, who transforms into the man with the hat. He tells her he will make her family kill each other and have Dr. Mohnhan erase her memory of ever having a family. Livia screams in terror as she realizes the full extent of her nightmarish situation. A flashback to when the man with the hat, whose real name is Abs, was still alive. He was a devout and religious man. After losing his wife, Nora, and their son in an accident, he was deeply devastated and began praying every day, asking God to reveal the wisdom behind the loss and to understand why he took his family away. His grief led him to despise anyone with a family. One day, Abs encounters a young cold child and believes that God has answered his prayers by sending him another child to care for. As time passes, Abs meets two black individuals named Grafton and Martha, who are stranded because their car broke down. Abus helps them, welcoming them into his town and assuring them that the town is unique, where everyone is united and follows the teachings of the Bible. However, the townspeople, including Abs, are hostile towards Grafton and Martha because of their skin color. They want them to leave after fixing their car. Abus discusses with local farmers about the drought and how God has seemingly neglected them. Meanwhile, Grafton checks if their car is repaired and mentions that the road is still long. Martha, who is pregnant, is mocked by the townsfolk for her skin color and the way they believe she will give birth differently because of it. The townspeople are baffled by the ease with which the African man found water, suspecting him of witchcraft. That night, Abus prays again, questioning God about Grafton and Martha, unsure of what to do or who is right or wrong. Meanwhile, Grafton and Martha continue to suffer from the poor treatment and prejudice of the townspeople. One night, Abs sees Martha standing and holding her stomach, looking strange and unsettling. The next morning, when Martha talks to Abs, he perceives her in a terrifying and bizarre way. He tells her that God has enlightened him and shown her true nature, but Martha accuses him of saying this because he no longer needs them and only brought them into the town to help with their work while her husband would find water for them. Abus, angered by this, suspects that Grafton might not be her husband since he doesn't wear a wedding ring. When Martha beats Abus in response to his insults, the townspeople decide to imprison both Martha and Grafton. Miles, feeling sympathy for their plight, goes to free them after everyone else leaves, but the townspeople manage to recapture them and decide on their punishment. One of the townspeople cites a passage from their Bible that states anyone who harms a stranger seeking help will suffer for eternity. Despite this, Abs decides to impose the punishment of heating iron and driving it into their eyes, blinding them as a consequence of their supposed theft. As Abs and the townspeople burn Martha and Grafton, the entire town suddenly catches fire, and everyone is tortured by the flames. Miles takes Abs to the basement, where Abs discovers that Miles is not a child, but a demon. Miles tells Abs that if he wants to avoid dying now, he must agree to kill and torture people to make them suffer in exchange for his own respite from torment. Abs agrees to this deal without hesitation, returning to the present time, where Betty is trying to find a way to escape from the place where she is imprisoned. She discovers that the door is not locked and quickly exits, running to escape before George can see her. At the same moment, George kills Betty as she tries to flee. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Nurse Burgess tries to sedate Livia to take her to the operating room, but she manages to resist and escapes to the changing room. She puts on some clothes and heads to the operating room with Dr. Mohnhan, before any surgery takes place, and she dies. After leaving the hospital, Livia encounters a security guard who is also of African descent like her. He allows her to escape without speaking. Meanwhile, Ruby attacks Earl with a hairdryer in the basement, killing him. Marty, frightened, flees, but Henry pursues him with a gun, and they shoot him. At that moment, the townspeople watch the events unfold. Marty's wife is terrified and threatens Henry, saying she will call the police and insults him, calling him a derogatory term. The mocking man laughs at Henry for being weak and for allowing Marty's wife to insult him. Ruby then asks Gracie to stay at home and not to leave. Gracie, afraid of Vera appearing to her, insists that Vera is just a figment of her imagination. Ruby leaves Gracie and goes to her father. Suddenly, she hears a terrifying voice calling her, and the place shifts to a school. There, Ruby sees Doris in distorted versions and is told that she has become like her mother, a copy of her. When Ruby looks in the mirror, her reflection is her mother's, and she is told she killed Chester while cleaning him and now will clean herself too. Suddenly, the scene shifts to Livia attacking Ruby in an attempt to kill her. Meanwhile, Gracie hears Vera calling from the closet. When she approaches, she is suddenly pulled away and disappears. When Henry enters the house, he finds himself in a theater watching a show featuring the mocking man. Henry becomes furious and questions where Ruby and Gracie are. The mocking man points Henry toward the theater seats, and Henry sees himself sitting with his two daughters, enjoying the show. Henry realizes this is the same day Livia left the house, and their son Chester died. The mocking man continues to urge Henry toward revenge, encouraging him to kill all the residents. At the same time, Marty argues with Clark, refusing to participate in any crime against Henry and his family. Marty continues to insult Clark until Clark loses his temper, attacks Marty, and crushes his legs. Clark then leaves, driving away in his car. At the same moment, Livia arrives at her home, but all the neighborhood residents confront her, describing her and her family as animals and demanding that she leave immediately. Livia, enraged, shouts, which frightens everyone into silence. Once she enters her house, she hears Gracie's voice coming from the closet. Livia follows the sound and finds Vera torturing Gracie. Livia engages in a fierce struggle with Vera. Gracie, during the commotion, retrieves a sketchbook from under her bed, which she had used for drawing. She looks at a drawing of Vera and tears it up. At that moment, Vera splits in half and disappears. Livia returns to her house, reassures Gracie, and then sees Ruby in the bathroom holding a piece of broken glass and cutting her face. Livia tries to stop Ruby, but Ruby, terrified, resists. Livia assures Ruby that she'll never hurt her and takes the glass from her hands. Ruby, scared and crying, is comforted by her mother. Livia then finds Henry, who is crying and devastated, in a place far from reality. She helps him come back to his senses, and Henry feels relieved when he sees Livia with him. Just then, the mocking man appears again, and Henry is shot. Henry realizes that he can never be like the mocking man. Livia and Henry then discover that their garden is on fire and try to come up with a plan to escape from the house. As Livia goes down to the basement, she tells Henry that the situation is not over yet. There, she encounters Abs with his son Chester. Livia, moved, embraces Chester and cries. Abs tells her that if she leaves her world and lives with her son, she will live without pain or suffering. However, Livia telling him that he causes her pain and suffering so that he doesn't feel his own. She tells him that she sees him and is not afraid of him. Abs becomes frightened and breaks down, trying to seek help from Miles, but is abandoned. Abbas then burns. Henry and his family escape from the house, and all the neighborhood residents gather in front of their home. They face the situation with courage and defiance, no longer afraid or anxious as they were before. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification button. See ya!